You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. This is Canada's most irreverent talk show. We have talked a lot on this program about vaccine mandates, federal, provincial, international. One that we have not focused on as much is the Canadian Armed Forces vaccine mandate. And part of this is because I think it was part of, certainly when I was discussing it, it was part of the broader vaccine mandates that the Liberal government put in last fall for the entire civil service. But there have been different nuances to it that I think make it worth taking an extra look at this. And one of them, I think, is the demographic profile of who it is that's in the Canadian Armed Forces. These are the people at the least risk possible for having serious complications from COVID-19, but also the idea of authority and obedience and the chain of command, these things that have really, I think, complicated the ability for someone to say no to this vaccine or to say no to following the mandate. Well, there's a proposed class action now against this vaccine mandate, representing so far hundreds of people that were put on leave whose future careers in the Canadian Armed Forces are still in uncertain territory because of this mandate. This has been fought by Catherine Christensen, who's a lawyer based in Alberta and the founder of the Valour Legal Action Centre, which is a not-for-profit that is fighting this case. Catherine Christensen joins me now. Thanks so much for coming on the show today. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, Andrew. We're happy to be here.
So what is this case about, really? Obviously, the vaccine mandate, incredibly disruptive, I would argue just plain wrong, but we also know that it caused a number of issues as far as shortages, confusion, not to mention the legal rights aspect of this. But what is really the core of this class action you're proposing to bring?
Well, Andrew, I've been watching the Canadian Armed Forces for a few years. My practice has always been with military and veterans. And I have noticed a real trend in some of the things that they were doing to their people. And then last October, I was approached by a group of hundreds of serving military, who were affected by the first directive, the mandate, and now subsequently mandate 2A and 3. And I have to tell you that it was sort of the perfect package to bring what is essentially an abuse of power lawsuit against the Canadian Armed Forces. It's not about the mandate itself, it's about how the Canadian Armed Forces have abused their people, and their chain of command is in absolute chaos. And for all of General Ayer's talking about everyone has to follow his orders, they aren't. And it's caused some very big consequences for some very dedicated, long-serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
For people that haven't followed the intricacies of this, when you say mandate 1, mandate 2, 2A, 3, what are you referring to there? What are those different mandates that have come in or updates to the mandate?
Right. So last October, the Chief of Defense Staff issued a directive. And the first directive was to bring in that COVID-19 vaccines were now mandatory for service in the Canadian Armed Forces. He then subsequently did a couple of amendments with a second directive, and then an amendment of that second directive, which I call 2A. And then just recently, in the last month, he's brought down Directive 3, which was touted as removal of the mandate. It doesn't actually remove the mandate. It continues if you want to do anything in the Canadian Armed Forces. But what it did was say that, well, if we haven't already released you, which was under the first directives, that if you didn't get the vaccine, you were to be discharged under a 5F, which used to be dishonorable, but is been made honorable in the last couple of years. Some of these people were not released in the 30 days like they were threatened with. And so they've been told now to come back to work, but they've been put into situations where they're sitting by themselves in empty buildings. They've been told they don't basically get to do anything. In fact, I have one person who is unvaccinated, was told to come back to work, and he's been assigned to help take care of people who are quarantined for COVID-19. So ironically, that's what this is. The Chief of Defense Staff should have said, because under the National Defense Act, Section 126, he has the power to say that you must be vaccinated to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. If you refuse, you are brought with a charge and court-martialed. They didn't do that. They went to what was called remedial measures and basically did an administrative process, which is completely unanswerable until it gets brought into court, which can take years because it may go through a grievance process. So that's
And
one of
just
the
to
questions
confirm,
I
what
have.
happens to people in that interim period while they're waiting for a court date?
They basically are suspended. They can't put anyone in the Canadian Armed Forces under a leave without pay. The Canadian Armed Forces are different than the federal employees. They have to ask for a leave without pay. They cannot be ordered to take a leave without pay. So that was part of the issue with the first directive, because they talked about putting people on leave without pay. Of course, that was challenged and they had to backtrack. So the people that haven't had anything happen to them in the past year have basically been sitting at home waiting to be released, as they were threatened they would be released, and they haven't been. Now they've been
Now,
told to come back to work.
why is it that the Canadian Armed Forces mandate seems to be distinct in terms of how it's unfolded and what the challenges are compared to the broader public service mandate that applied just in a blanket way to everyone in the federal public service? Why are these two different animals?
One of the big differences is that how people were treated in the Canadian Armed Forces compared to the federal service. In the federal service, they basically were sent home on leave without pay. When their mandate was suspended, they were told to come back to work. In the Canadian Armed Forces, we have the Chief of Defense Staff going on the national news telling people that don't get vaccinated and want to serve in a uniform aren't worthy, that they're morally weak, that their ethics aren't where they should be, basically name calling them and isolating them, which is a form of discrimination, and I would even argue maybe some harassment. Then we get what actually happened to people on the ground as these directives were being unrolled, from pregnant women who didn't know if they wanted to take the vaccine, being charged with AWOL because their obstetrician put them in the hospital due to the stress, to young sailors being isolated in a room with 4 officers and told to sign a piece of paper that they wouldn't follow a lawful order under complete coercion, to a young man made to stand outside in January at attention where all his co-workers go past him and say, because he wouldn't take the vaccine. He lasted a month before he'd lost 15 pounds of muscle mass and mentally couldn't do it anymore. And he voluntarily released because he just couldn't cope with the punishment that his commanding officer was giving him. I mean, if she had done that to someone who was a prisoner of war, she'd be charged with a war crime and be brought up in The Hague for it. This is how these people were being treated. It wasn't a case that they were just told, well, go home, and then they just sat at home and did nothing. They were actually being deliberately isolated. They were told they would go to jail. They were told that their families would starve, that they would receive no benefits, that their pensions were gone. All of these things are not true. And so it was very different for these people who were in uniform, that absolutely dedicated their lives to serving Canada and then were being treated like garbage and thrown out like garbage, in my opinion.
I want to go back to what you said a moment ago about being asked to agree that they were not following a lawful order, because everyone knows that in military there's a chain of command and that you do need to have a level of obedience, but this has been clarified over time, and it's that you have to obey lawful orders. And interestingly enough, just this week there was the story in the Canadian press that the Chief of the Defense Staff was warned that this mandate might not actually be a lawful order. So there isn't actually something we could take for granted here that the Canadian Armed Forces can rely on, that this was in fact a lawful order.
Exactly. The Canadian Armed Forces have a reputation internationally for having smart people that are willing to question and willing to say to their chain of command, I don't think that's a lawful order, or no, I will not do that based on my ethics or my religion, whatever the case may be. And so that's what they came up against when they issued these directives. Because how it usually works in the military is you don't get the Chief of Defense Staff doesn't issue a directive. He issues an order, and then the directive is the instructions to his chain of command how that order is going to be carried out. That didn't happen here. He instead brought these directives out and said, well, that's an order. but they were so vague and so jumbled that the chain of command across the country all implemented it differently. It was absolute chaos. Someone on one base was doing another admiral on the West Coast was doing something else. So this caused people to say, is this a lawful order? And the other part of it is, Andrew, is their rights. Just because they put on a uniform doesn't mean they gave up their rights as a Canadian citizen. They still maintain all those rights. And one of the rights you have is to bodily autonomy and whether you wish to consent to a medical treatment. And that was what the Chief of Defense Staff tried to take away from these people. We have the Admiral of the Vice Admiral, who's Commander of the Navy now, telling people that they didn't have bodily autonomy if they were in the Canadian Armed Forces. Well, that raises a lot of questions, because if they have no bodily autonomy, then does that mean the Chief of Defense Staff can say, well, I don't have enough women in the military, so therefore I can order people to have sex changes? Because that's what he's saying. He says he has the power to order any medical treatment for any member of the Canadian Armed Forces, and they're not allowed to disagree. So this is part of why I chose to do this, because it is extremely upsetting to the people I represent. And it was upsetting to me as I started to hear the stories.
There are some deployments where certain vaccines would make sense. If you're going to Mali, for example, you should probably get your meningitis vaccine and so on. The rationale for COVID vaccination has been, I think, increasingly precarious, the logic on which it rests, especially as we've learned it doesn't block transmission. So whether you get vaccinated as a soldier does not have any bearing on whether the person you're bunking with is going to get COVID increasingly. So what is the rationale on which the Canadian Armed Forces has relied? Or is it simply, we're telling you to do it, so you have to do it?
Well, part of what they relied on was a draft from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and it was a draft. We have searched for a final version. They can't produce one. So they had a draft document from Public Health Canada, which the Peckford questioning, the Peckford documents have revealed that Public Health Canada never recommended vaccination as a mitigation measure, I guess I could call it. So relying on that certainly isn't going to be standing up. And we had the Chief of Defense Staff on national media saying that his reasoning was that it was to prevent transmission, that we were going...
Which Pfizer doesn't say anymore.
Right, exactly. And the Canadian Armed Forces were supposed to set an example. In fact, in his first directive and other subsequent directives, the first priority was to set an example for the Canadian population. That's not a reason to mandate a medical treatment to your troops. That's not taking care of your people. Because if it's a vaccine that isn't even fully tested yet, I mean, Dr. Lorenko from the Government of Canada admitted under questioning and under oath that the human trials are not over, that the human trials are the general population. And the other factor we have here, Andrew, is the people that serve in the Canadian Armed Forces are extremely low risk to die from COVID or to have serious COVID. They're fit, they're young. There has been more vaccine injuries than anything else from this whole thing. And they can't ever point to one death in the Canadian Armed Forces from COVID. They can't even point to serious illness of anyone in the Canadian Armed Forces. So how are you rationalizing a treatment to your people that is more dangerous to them than the actual disease itself?
Yeah, and I think that's such a critical point here. It's a critical point because the vaccine is something that I think should, for any reason, be a personal choice. If you feel it will put you in better standing, take it. If you don't feel it that way, don't take it. But if you look at the numbers, no one has ever argued, even the most alarmist, that COVID is a death sentence for a fit, healthy 20-something, 30-something-year-old. And to the contrary, I mean, for 20, 30, 40-year-old men, we know that the vaccine itself, and numerous studies have showed this, actually poses more risk when you're talking about things like myocarditis and other things. things. And I don't even want to make this a scientific discussion because it should be based on individual choice. But I think your point is a valid one. And I take you at your word there. There has not been a single COVID fatality in the Canadian Armed Forces, you say.
Right, not a one. But I can tell you there's been lots of vaccine injuries from myocarditis. I have clients in this lawsuit who have had to have open heart surgery that were fit and healthy. I know of deaths of fit and healthy young men who died in their sleep, which should not be happening. So,
Wow.
I question the rationale behind this, because I don't think they have, if they want to say they relied on the science, I don't think the science is backing them up.
What's the timeline of your legal challenge?
I expect to be filing in the next few months. As you can imagine, I have over 300 people confirmed as plaintiffs. There's a couple hundred more that have reached out, but we've set a deadline cutoff of October 31st on Monday. And then you can imagine writing several hundred affidavits. And I would say I have, a truckload, about 100,000 pages of evidence to make sure is all ready before we head into the court. And the statement of claim is ready. I'm just getting all the rest of the I's dotted and T's crossed to bring it forward. It is coming. It is not going to go away.
And just to put kind of the technicalities forward here, this is a proposed class action. So you're fighting this on behalf of all members of the Canadian Armed Forces, even those who aren't members of this legal challenge, correct?
Yes, if I can get it certified as a class action, absolutely. The other thing is that to counter the government's favorite strategy of running people out of money, I created a nonprofit, the Valour Legal Action Center, which is helping cover the cost of the litigation, because litigation against the government is very expensive. But it also means that because the nonprofit runs on donations, people weren't having to come out and hire a lawyer for a couple $100,000 each to bring their claim forward. That's why we put together the group, we put together the nonprofit, because I firmly believe this is a question that needs to be answered in a court of, was that a lawful order, and was it handled in the way it should have been handled, or should he have used the National Defense Act as he had the power to do and chose not to?
And we'll put that up on the screen there right now, valourlegalactioncentre.org. And that's the Canadian spelling, center with an R-E, valourlegalactioncentre.org. Catherine Christensen joins me now. Catherine, thank you so much for your work on this. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too, Andrew. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.